Good morning. Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Schoeneck King Spring 2026 Special Education Update. We have a great crowd in person, and we have a considerable number of attendees on Zoom. So two dimensions coming together for this great program. Um, we have a jam-packed, substantive agenda today. We have an all-star panel of special ed attorneys. Let's talk about the day. What are we going to have? Well, we're going to start with Catherine or Katie Stifler, who will speak on alternative assessments, everybody's favorite and confusing topic. So we're going to start with that. Then I'm going to speak on the continuum of service options, another fun topic for your cocktail parties. Then we're going to take a break. Then Andrew Mark, we all know Andrew works in the Buffalo office. He'll be talking about pattern determinations and other aspects of the student discipline process. And then we're going to finish up with Ann McGinnis, who is going to speak on IEEs and evaluations. So again, we like to focus on topics that are practical to your day-to-day lives. So that's what we're here for today. We have a lot to cover, but we try to make this interactive. So if you have questions, please raise your hand. If you're online, you can send us on Zoom, and we'll try to incorporate as many questions as possible, because that makes the program fun. And if you send us a very difficult question, we'll just ignore it, and then we'll move on, and we're good to go. And we're good to go. So just want to let you know, thank you. This is also thank you for celebrating with me. Today's my 25th wedding anniversary. So how about that? And I'm getting older, and it's starting to kick in. We were what college nesters. This is now a word where all your kids are in college. So kind of have the place to yourself. And what's scary is there's this new thing. It's called Instagram. I just heard of it, and they have these videos where they go, "Hey, Dad, what was it like in the '90s?" You see these videos, and all these celebrities showing, and I'm just like, well, I was working in the '90s, so it's not much different. But they should have the videos for the '80s. Like that would have been up, my that's up my alley. And I keep thinking about, because doing school law, education, internet, and like I don't know why, but I keep going back to in elementary school. I'm now Abe Lincoln telling them that I used to walk in the snow with no shoes, 40 miles and so on. But I try telling this to my kids. Does anyone remember walking to the public library and looking for encyclopedias? Do you remember that? And like the world, and I think we even have a world book in my parents' house apartment from the 50s. So like you catch an old encyclopedia and it would become outdated. But now you got that all in the palm of your hand. So I don't know, just starting to see things from a different perspective as you gain more experience. So we're going to start with Katie. So take it away, Katie, and enjoy the program. And we're going to take a break after the second presentation. So thanks again for coming.
If you have questions, I will come to you so that you can say them in the microphone so that the people listening at home can hear them.
All right, good morning, everybody. Along the social media theme, I found yesterday that SED has a TikTok account. Jeff, we can talk about TikTok. We can sort of touch base on that after. There's about 15 videos or so on there. So for those of you who are looking for more social media content specifically around education, check out SED's TikTok. I don't know what their handle is or if that's what it's called, but there it is. All right, so like Jeff said, the first topic we are going to be discussing today is the New York State alternate assessment, affectionately known as NYSA. And we're going to focus on the eligibility criteria that the CSE looks at to determine whether a student is eligible to take NYSA for the NYSA versus the state or district-wide assessments. All right, so the requirement for New York State and other states to have an alternate assessment comes from two pieces of federal legislation. The first is the Every Student Succeeds Act, and the second is the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And both of those require that all students, including our students with the most significant disabilities, are included in state or district-wide assessment programs. For students who are unable to participate in the state's general assessments because of the severity of their disabilities, even with providing accommodations, states, including New York State, are required to develop and implement an alternate assessment. So this is where we get NYSA. This is why the state has it. Comes from these two pieces of legislation that requires us to ensure that all of our students are being assessed. All right, the following definitions come straight from Part 100 of the New York State Commissioner's regulations. So the definition of students with severe disabilities is below, and only students with severe disabilities are eligible to participate in NYSA. So what do we mean when we say students with severe disabilities? So the regulations defines that as a student who has limited cognitive abilities combined with behavioral and/or physical limitations, and who require highly specialized education, social, psychological, and medical services in order to maximize their full potential for useful and meaningful participation in society and for self-fulfillment. The regulations go on to tell us that students with severe disabilities may also experience severe speech, language, and/or perceptual cognitive impairments, and the evidence challenging behaviors that interfere with learning and socialization opportunities. These students may also have extremely fragile physiological conditions and may require personal care. All right, so before we move further into the eligibility, a few key pieces to keep in mind. The CSE determines whether a student is eligible to participate in NYSA. So this is a determination that the Committee on Special Education makes. It's done on a case-by-case basis. So while we have eligibility criteria to help us think through and determine which students are eligible, this is done on an individualized case-by-case basis. And this is an annual determination by the CSE. All right, so we said that only students who have a severe cognitive disability are eligible for NYSA. How do we determine whether a student has a severe cognitive disability? So the CSE is going to use a range of information, including both qualitative and quantitative information related to the student's skills. So this is going to include evaluations, classroom data, as well as anecdotal information to help us inform whether the student is eligible. That information has to indicate that that specific student has limited cognitive abilities combined with behavioral and/or physical limitations, and that the student also requires that highly specialized education and/or social, psychological, and medical services. This is coming straight from that definition that we talked about earlier, in order to maximize their full potential for useful and meaningful participation in society and for self-fulfillment. All right, Anne, did you want to jump in with the decision-making, SED's decision-making tool?
Sure. So that link there, you might be familiar with the SED decision-making tool that came out in the past couple of years. And it's kind of written like a flow chart, and it has these areas in it. So it says the student has significantly limited cognitive abilities and significant deficits in communication and language, and significant deficits in adaptive behavior. And there's actually a stop sign that says if the student doesn't meet all of those criteria, stop, the student is not eligible for alternate assessment. But if you don't have to stop, then you have to continue on. And it's the student requires a highly specialized educational program that facilitates the acquisition, application, or transfer of skills across natural environments. And the student requires AT, assistive technology, and support systems to address medical, health, personal care, or behavioral needs. Does anybody have any thoughts about this? I do. So my thought is this is not what the legal definition and the regulations say for NISA eligibility. This takes that definition and really expands it and makes it much more stringent. So there's nothing in the legal definition, which Katie read to you at an earlier slide, that says a student must require assistive technology or that a student must have a speech or language need or communication need in some way, or that all of these every single one of these factors are required. It's not written that way. It actually says things like and or in the definition that raises those as being some factors to consider. So I don't know. I usually don't know what SED is doing. But I'm not sure what their goal is here in taking a legal definition that establishes criteria in the regulations for a student being eligible for this, and then making it much more stringent without what I can find any legal basis for that. Part of me wonders if it's because we have this 1% cap and maybe SED is making it more stringent criteria for a student to meet that, and that would help districts be under that 1% cap. I've heard rumblings that there are some RAs out there that are saying that this is just guidance. It's not the law, but we all know that different RAs have different interpretations of things. And it's certainly not written as if this is something you can choose to do. When there's big stop signs that say stop if the student does not meet all these criteria, it sends the message that it's required. So this could come up as an issue in a state complaint or in a due process hearing. A parent could use this as evidence that their child should not be alternately assessed if they don't meet all of these criteria. And there are districts that are over the 1% cap who are struggling with this, because if you're over that cap, you have to give a justification to SCD for why you have to do that. I think you have to watch a video or something. There's certain things that you need to do if you're over that. And it's hard, you wonder if you're giving your justification for why these students meet criteria, but they don't meet all of these, because it's very few students who do. There's plenty of students who we know probably do meet the legal definition of needing to be alternately assessed or being eligible for not needing, but being eligible for that, but don't meet this criteria. I've seen that in many situations for districts who are struggling with this. So something to think about. I don't know what's going on. I don't know if this is the new discipline issue. You know how SED's been on this bandwagon with discipline and manifestation determinations and has really been very specific, although it's taken a few years to get to that specificity with them about their interpretation of Part 201 of the regulations related to protections for students with disabilities for discipline. I don't know if now we're seeing this alternate assessment come down the pike, and if this is going to be the next thing that SED is going to have expectations for districts that may be different than our understanding. I don't know. But have any of you observed that there's kind of this difference between the SED guidance and the law? Okay, seeing some heads nod, and I can feel some heads nodding online right now. So, okay. All right, go ahead, Katie.
All right, so the SED guidance and regulations also tell us that the CSE has to make sure that there's a couple of factors that we make sure we're not solely basing the decision onto whether a student is eligible for NISA. Those include ensuring that the CSE's decision is not solely based on the student's disability category, educational environment, or instructional setting. So a student's program placement is not going to be the determinative factor. It's one factor, but we don't look at where a student is or what their disability classification is and say, okay, the student is classified as a student with autism, so that means they're NISA eligible. They might be, but again, it's an individual evaluation. The decision also cannot be solely based on the student's language differences, excessive or extended absences from school, cultural or environmental factors, a student's previous low academic achievement, or a student's previous need for accommodations to participate in either state or district-wide assessments. So again, there's a lot of different factors to consider. It's not that these can't be part of the conversation necessarily, but we can't be basing the decision on any one of these.
I just want to point something out that's probably obvious to all of you. Deciding that a student is going to be alternately assessed is a really big deal because it means the student will not receive a high school diploma. That's what it means. So we are changing the trajectory of this student's education experience. And that's another reason why there are so many, the CSE has explicit requirements in determining if a student meets this eligibility or not. It's also a reason that maybe we don't have to be in a big rush to make the decision. There's nothing about when in a child's education that we would make this decision, and it should be an individual decision for every child. But if there's any chance that a student might be able to earn a high school diploma, and remember, and this is all changing with the portrait of the graduate, but right now we have the superintendent's determination where students are able to earn credit within the curriculum and sit for the Regents exams. Even if they can't pass the Regents exams, they could still get a local diploma through that superintendent's determination. So if there's any chance that a student might be able to earn a diploma, we should really defer that decision to the next year and see if that student is able to make progress in the curriculum in the way that we want so that they could potentially earn that diploma.
All right, so students who do not have an IEP are not eligible for NYSA. So if you look at the decision-making tool that Anne referenced that we hyperlinked to, that's at the very top of that. It says, does the student have an IEP? No, it kicks you out and says, the student is not going to be eligible for NYSA. So step one, student has to have an IEP in order to be eligible. Additionally, students who are classified with a learning disability or with a speech or language impairment only are not eligible for NYSA per the guidance. And some of the reasoning behind this has to do with the Part 200 regulations, definitions of the classification for learning disability and speech or language impairment only, that references that we're typically not seeing an intellectual component to students who meet those classifications, and so typically not going to be eligible for NYSA. All right, so the next couple of slides we mentioned, we have some qualifying language about generally students in the following categories are or are not eligible. Again, keep in mind that like Anne and I have mentioned, this is an individualized determination for each student. So the student's classification is going to be relevant, but we're not going to have the CSE look at the classification and have that be the sole determinant as to whether a student is eligible. So generally, students who are in the following disability categories are going to very rarely be eligible for NYSA. These are students who meet the disability classification for deafness, hearing impairment, emotional disability, orthopedic impairment, other health impairment, and visual impairment. And you will see this laid out also in that guidance document. It takes you through this as well. And like Anne said, it's pretty rigid. So if you are going through this and you need sort of some assistance thinking through, it's worth reaching out, making sure that the CSE is making this on an individualized basis. All right, so we have generally students in these categories are going to very rarely be eligible. Generally, students in these following categories are going to be more likely to meet eligibility criteria compared to students who are in the other disability categories. So there's students classified with autism, deaf, blindness, an intellectual disability, multiple disabilities, and a traumatic brain injury. Again, this doesn't mean that students who have these classifications are automatically eligible, just means compared to the other classifications on this slide, they're more likely to be eligible for NYSA. All right, so once the CSE has determined that a student is eligible for NYSA, there's a couple of things that we need to make sure are on that student's IEP. So if the CSE determines that the student is going to participate in NYSA, the IEP has to indicate that. There's a specific section and heading on the IEP that indicates whether the student is NYSA eligible. And we also have to provide a statement as to why that student is eligible and why NYSA is appropriate for that particular student. Additionally, for a student who is recommended by the CSE to participate in NYSA, each annual goal on that student's IEP has to also include short-term instructional objectives and/or benchmarks. So for a student who is NYSA eligible, their IEP has to reflect that. It has to include a statement as to why NYSA is appropriate. And then we also have to make sure that the goals on that student's IEP also include short-term instructional objectives and/or benchmarks for those goals. I thought you were raising your hand to add something. Okay. All right. In some cases, the CSE may recommend a student who has a severe cognitive disability participate in NYSA for selected assessment areas based on the student's need, and may determine that it's appropriate for the student to, that they can achieve the New York State standards for other assessment areas. NYSED guidance indicates that what they have seen historically is that very few students sort of meet this sort of hybrid situation where CSE would find that they're eligible to participate in NYSA for selected assessments, but then for others, they can participate with all other students. Do you want to add?
My legal analysis of this is that this is weird. So has anybody ever done this before? And I guess that's bad to start that way. And it's allowed to do it. I've never seen it. Has anybody ever done this before? The reason I think it's weird is what do we do about a diploma, about graduation options, right? Because if the student is participating in NYSA for math, they're not going to be able to earn the credits they need in math to be able to graduate. So that's why I think it's weird. But apparently SED says that it's permissible. I have not seen that. And I just wanted to say that if a student is not NYSA eligible in high school, they have to be working towards the curriculum. So they have to be at least given the opportunity to try to earn credits and sit for the Regents examinations. There is no in-between. And I know that a lot of in-betweens happen for practical reasons and different types of programs, but that is not the way it's supposed to go. If they are not NYSA eligible, they need to be trying to accrue credits and sitting for the Regents examinations at the high school level. I'm going to pass this to you.
I guess to your point, why would you do NYSA for math and not English and then not go for a CDOS credential as opposed to the SAC?
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at. Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? Okay. Excuse me.
All right, so earlier Anne referenced the 1% cap. So the federal regulations limit the number of students in each state who must take alternate assessments to 1% of all tested students per subject. So this is the 1% cap that was referenced. And the purpose of having the 1% cap is, again, to ensure that the vast majority of our students are taking the state's general assessments and that the CSE is only finding students with the most significant cognitive disabilities eligible for NYSA. So we have this 1% cap. As Anne mentioned, any district that assesses more than 1% of students in any subject with an alternate assessment has to submit information to SED, essentially justifying why they have to exceed the 1% cap in that assessment area. Okay, do we have any additional questions? Anything online?
Okay, yep. I'm coming. No, it's okay. I'm getting my steps in. No, you got it. You got to go on here. I'm sorry. I know. I
had a
don't
big
think
mouth.
either. No, but they can't use.
So when I hear the 1% cap, how do you distinguish between a student who is severely significant cognitive impairment? If you're sitting for, if you're able to participate in some components of like an IQ test, like the word significantly, I'm very hung up on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think most school psychologists would be hung up on that. Who's really good at the bell curve and knows what is a percentile for a standard score of a 70? Does anybody know off the top of their head? I used to know this, but I don't. Oh, definitely under 15. Do you know? It's 5? Okay, so somebody's saying close to 5. So that's tough, right? So 70 is not the magic number that you're going to see in the law anywhere, right? We're not going to see a 70, below a 70 for an intellectual disability definition. But I think that most school psychologists and most CSEs are trained to really think about maybe that pattern of being below a 70 for cognitive ability, adaptive behavior and achievement when we're looking at an intellectual disability classification. And this is really implying that these students probably meet criteria for an intellectual disability. But if 5% of our bell curve is at that 70 or below, that's different from 1%. So that's another reason probably the SED has these other criteria. So you might have a student who has a full scale IQ of a 68, but who doesn't need assistive technology or language and communication needs. And according to SED, that student would not meet criteria for NYSA. But what we know about that student might be that this student can't be in the general education curriculum. This isn't right for this student. They need to be working on something else. That is a conundrum for the CSE to consider. And I don't have a straight answer of what to do, except it should be an individual student decision. There's nothing that says that all of their IQ composites have to be below a 70. There's nothing that says anything about a 70, right? We take into consideration the totality of the circumstances with that understanding in the backs of our minds that we're supposed to be below the 1% cap. So it's very few of our students who are really going to meet those criteria. And I think that there's a lot of districts who in good faith feel that there's no way with their population to stay under 1%, because it's tough to make a decision about an individual student because you want to be below a certain point that has nothing to do with that student, right? That 1%. So again, an individual decision, make sure the CSE has gathered enough information to get there and that you have a justification for why you made that decision for that student. If you end up over the 1% cap, that justification will be an important part of your response to SED for why you are. But I don't have like a perfect answer to that.
Other questions? Okay. All right, Jeff, you are up. Yeah.
All right. Now something a little easier like that. No math in this one, right? It's 2% and so on. So, okay, we're talking about the continuum. And the continuum is very important. It actually has its own section in the regs. If you look through 200, everybody knows like 200.1 and 2, there's definitions. There's one section about policies. There's one section about CSE process and evaluations. There's one section about due process. And there's a whole section on the continuum. And it gets overlooked. The continuum is basically all your placement options. And it doesn't come to the surface that much. And there are some myths about the continuum. And so let's kind of break it down and see what we're talking about. Now, the biggest part of the continuum, technically, everything is on the continuum. So if you are a related services only student, you're on the continuum somewhere. If you are consultant teacher, you're on the continuum somewhere. If you're home instructed, and the continuum is based on restrictiveness, less restrictive and most restrictive. And there's actually the least restrictive option is you're in a regular classroom all day and you're never pulled out and you're getting some supports there. The most restrictive is, well, it's actually debates on what's the most restrictive. We could have a hot debate. Is it home instruction? Is it being far away? There are lots of variables to consider. But we're going to talk, for starters, on the special class continuum. Now, a special class, and there's a definition. What's a special class? Basically, it's a special class, but it's only students with disabilities. So if you're in a special class, there has to be a special ed teacher, and there has to only be students with disabilities. And this teacher is actually given the instruction. So kind of different from like co-teaching or consultant teacher is you got a gen ed teacher and a special ed teacher kind of doing different things for the same purpose. Special classes are different. It's only a special ed teacher. And again, if you look at the definition of it, it's consisting of students with disabilities, and they have to be grouped together because of similar individual needs. So sometimes in the world of litigation, when the parent is upset and will hire an attorney to say, do whatever you can to show this placement's inappropriate, one of the things they could argue is the kids aren't properly grouped. This does come up. And so let's kind of talk about this special. So let's go through the options. Now, what this might be a surprise to some of you. This might be a surprise, but there are actual definitions for each special class option about what type of students should be in there. I don't think schools realize this, to be honest. And I think, you hear, oh, we have this class we do it this way. We'll do a behavioral kids with low academics, or we'll do a little management, a little this, and that's great, and it works. And the odds are no one will ever call you out for it. But it's good to know what what are the rules here. So let's take some time and take a look at what is this. So 15-1. Now, 15-1 is a strange one because 15-1 is not really defined as clearly as the others. So what we know from 15-1, it's students whose special needs consist primarily of the need for specialized instruction, which can best be accomplished in a self-contained setting, and that group should not exceed 15 students. So that's it. It's basically kids whose primary need is specialized instruction. That's it. It's kind of like academic. There's no reference to behaviors, management, anything else. By process of elimination, they need specialized instruction. And if that's all you've got, kind of kids that maybe need a different, maybe a little slower pace, maybe taught a little different way, if that's all they need, you could group them together in a 15-1. Not much. So there's some debate. Now we're going to get into clear language at this point. By the way, 15-1, it's one teacher, 15 kids max. There's no reference to a classroom aide in a 15-1. So we have a hearing now, and for some reason, the hearing officer keeps referring to it as a 15-1-1. I'm just like, no, it's not that. So, okay. So the next one is 12-1-1. 12 kids, one teacher, one classroom aide. Who falls in that category right here? Students whose management needs interfere with the instructional process to the extent that an additional adult is needed within the classroom setting to assist in the instruction of such students. So here, management needs interfere with instruction. That's it. That's a 12-1-1. Now, what does that mean? Well, it's hard to really tell what that means until you start looking at the others. Okay, so hold that thought on 12-1-1, which is management needs interfere with the instructional process. Okay, excited? 8-1-1. Students whose management needs sound familiar? Wait a minute, management needs? They're back. These management needs are everywhere. Management needs are determined to be intensive. Okay, so that went up. So before it was interfere with instruction. Now they're intensive. And I got an and too, require a significant degree of individualized attention and intervention. Before it just said, it didn't say that. Oh no, it says additional adult is needed. So here, so it's higher, but we're really focusing on management needs. That's an 8-1-1. Because we usually think 8-1-1 is the ED, I hate to say it, like the behavior kids, the ED kids. I hear that a lot. I also hear it differently. Some people will say, no, those kids will go to 6-1-1. I'm just scratching my head. I'm just going, okay, so works for you, sounds good. But really, this is where the language is coming from. So 8-1-1 is management needs determined to be intensive. 6-1-1. Okay, excited? 611, students whose management needs, there it is again, it's everywhere, are determined to be, ready, highly intensive. Before it was intensive. So the highly gets you from an 811 to a 611 and require a high degree of individualized attention. That's up from significant degree. That's it. I mean, those are the big three. So we're going to talk about 1213 in a minute, but 611, 811, and 1211, that's what, management needs is the key factor. So when you're sitting at these meetings coming up with a placement, these are your variables. And if you're doing this really well, when you do your needs and your PLEPs, you're gonna maybe even use this language like, yeah, this person has highly intensive management needs. If you put that in a PLEP, you're probably going to wind up in a 611. I'm not saying work backwards, but this is the universe within which we're living. Now, 12-1, okay, here's another one. I'm calling it a 12-1-3. It might be a 12-1-4. It might be a 12-1-3. Like, I think this 3 is something to do with the ratio. But I couldn't, it would take 7 slides and an abacus to explain this. But we all know what this class is, right? And we're talking about more than one classroom aide based on the number of students in the class. And that deals with I think it's 3-to-1 ratio. So that's why you have lots of adults in this class. Now, who goes in this class, 12-1-3? It's students with severe multiple disabilities whose programs consist primarily of habilitation and treatment. Okay? So this is very different than the others. There's no mention of management needs. You're talking about a totally different category. Usually, a lot of these kids are alternately assessed. Maybe they call this life skills, but I don't think it automatically has to be life skills. You could theoretically still try to get a local diploma if you're here, although it's a lot of, that would be an interesting tightrope. But this is a completely different definition. 12-1-3 is severe multiple disabilities whose programs consist primarily of habilitation and treatment. So you don't want to just say, these kids need a lot more help, we'll put them there. There's really an actual rule. Does everyone got that? Now, just curious, don't have to, is this new? Or are you like, oh, I know this is old? Or, so for some of you, this might be new. For some of you, it might be old hat. Is that the saying? Old hat. I don't know. What does that mean? Old hat. I don't want to wear an old hat, but so okay. So we got that. So something interesting happened in a case. In fact, this is why I picked this topic, because there was a very interesting decision. So let me explain what happened here. So we had a federal case. So it was in federal law. There was a federal lawsuit in New York, and here was the issue in the federal case. So again, it was once a hearing, and partial hearing. Then it went to the SRO. Then it goes to federal court, federal district court. Then it goes up to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. That's a lot of litigation. Okay. And here is the issue. The parent said, I'm eligible for, the parent argued, I met the criteria. No, I'm sorry. Okay. The district said you meet the criteria for a 12-1-3. The parent said, the student meets the criteria for a 6-1-1. And as it turns out, they were both right. The way these definitions are met, especially with a 12-1-3, you could arguably meet both. So the parent was like, I want to be in, I want to be in the 6-1-1. The district said, no, you should be in a 12-1-3. So when you have competing definitions, which one wins? This was it. So it goes all the way up to the federal circuit court, and the federal circuit court says, this doesn't happen that much. It says, we're in federal court, but this is actually a state law decision. And we don't make state law decisions. So we're going to, there's a word for it. There's a word for it. It's called certification. The federal court certified this question and sent it to the New York State's highest court and said, you tell us the answer to this legal question. Which of these prompts the other? And so here was the question. The certified question is, when a student is covered by more than one class size regulation under 8 NYCR 200.684, do the varying restrictions serve as distinct requirements that must be independently fulfilled, or as a list of class size options for the DOE of the school may pick? So can we pick, or does one, do we have options here? And so, in other words, when a student meets the eligibility criteria for more than one, is entirely within the CSE's jurisdiction. So I imagine if you had a map. It's like you start at the district, then you go to Albany for the SRO, then you come back to New York City for a federal trial court, then you go up to the federal appeals, then you go up to New York State Court of Appeals, and then you're going to go right back down. This is crazy. But ultimately, the Court of Appeals said it's entirely within the CSE's discretion to select the placement option that would best serve the student's individual needs. So it's up to the CSE. If two of them are appropriate, it's up to the CSE to make that decision. And now is it. And then the Court of Appeals in New York State tells the federal court, and they make their decision. And so that's a long way. But that's it. So it really empowers the CSE to determine what the right placement option is. It's a victory for independence of the CSE. And how did the court reach this decision? Well, they look at the regulatory history that, when the congressmen or the assemblymen are coming up with the laws, they actually look and see what they were talking about at that time. And they saw that they wanted to give the CSE discretion to exercise its knowledge and expertise. So that's that. So if this ever comes up, if you're having a discussion with a parent over 12-1-3 versus any of those other placement options, the district has full discretion to decide whichever one it wants. Okay. Any questions on that? Okay. So let's talk about something else. Let's live in the world of let's live in the world of LRE. So we all know if a less restrictive environment can be appropriate with accommodations, you have to go that route. So, if you're in a regular class and a personal aid will help the student make progress in the regular class, we have to give the aid and leave the student in that class instead of going to the 8-1-1. That's the law, least restrictive, appropriate environment. That's easy. It's easy to compare. The gen ed setting is always less restrictive than a special class for lots of reasons. The question is a 15-1 less restrictive than a 12-1-1? is a 12-1-1 less restrictive than an 8-1-1? Is an 8-1-1 less restrictive than a 6-1-1? And I ask that because there are more kids in the bigger setting. And this does come up a lot. And we hear advocates push this too. They go, you know, you went from an 8-1-1 to a 6-1-1. That's more restrictive. You shouldn't have done that. It violates my LRE. Is that really true? Is that really true? And the answer probably is no. It's not 100%. But there are case law that says the key factor in LRE is exposure to non-disabled students. So there's the same number of non-disabled students in a 15-1, a 12-1-1, an 8-1-1, a 6-1-1, a 12-1-3. That would be 0. Therefore, the LRE analysis doesn't apply at all. And there's cases on that. Now, again, under a simple logic of, hey, there's less kids, I think you're still going to hear it. Have you heard that argument? Has anyone ever championed that argument? Like, you can't put them in a 6-1-1 because an 8-1-1 would work. That's not 100% correct. So kind of keep that in mind. But that is not the case for mainstreamed to special class. That's a big, big jump. So again, key factor is non-disabled kids and exposure to it. Okay. So now we're going to, still my topic, we're going to talk a few more things about special classes. There are some unique rules for special classes. We're living in the world of 15-1s, 12-1-1s, 8-1-1s, 6-1-1s, blah, 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 12-1-3. By the way, you really shouldn't, we're going to create a 4-1-1. You really can't do that. You can't, 7-1-1, now maybe with a variance, you have to stay within the regs. Now, if you recommend a 6-1-1 and there are 4 kids in there, it's still a 6-1-1 with 4 kids in there. So we don't call it that. And I know sometimes, we say like, hey, we got you in the 15-1, but there's really 3 kids in there. We still have to defend it as a 15-1. So similarity of need. A special class shall be composed of students with disabilities with similar individual needs. By the way, these are really relevant when the student's actually in the program. Let's say the student goes in the 6-1-1 for 6 months. The parent brings a challenge and says, hey, one of the reasons this program is inappropriate is because the kids are not in there. And there it's squarely an issue. Sometimes, due to pendency, we recommend a placement and the child doesn't go into the program because they stay in their old one. Sometimes they'll take them out and go to unilateral placement. Can the parent, does this argument apply in that case? Can you say the kids would have been different? Arguably, that's not allowed. It's called retrospective testimony because you make your recommendations at the time of it, at the time of the meeting, and you can never guarantee who's going to come in a week, you can't even guarantee who the teacher will be. Teacher could win the lottery. Kids can move in, kids can move out. So this usually applies squarely when the kid is in the program, although sometimes it does pop into the hearing. Sometimes we want it to. Sometimes we bring a class profile and we'll say these are the kids would have been, but that's something to keep in mind. So there's this general rule that the kids should be grouped with others with similar needs, individual needs. And some of these rules are very vague. So the size and composition of a special class shall be based on the similarity of the individual needs of the students. Remember though, we already have requirements, high management needs, intensive management needs, blah, blah, blah. Is there more? Well, there could be. You look at these are all the factors in the PLEPs: academic and educational achievement and learning characteristics, levels of social development, levels of physical development, the management needs of the students. Now, how much is this? It's hard to say. Like, if 3 out of 4 of these are met, is that good? Do all 4 have to be met? Nobody knows. There's very little case law on this. And how do you describe? It's not like you have a test score on management needs, but there is this concept. It's out there that you're going to want to have similar levels in these factors. But again, this is vague. Now, we have a couple of objective requirements also. Chronological age range within special classes with students who are less than 16 years of age. So if everyone is less than 16, the age range has to be 36 months. If all the kids are older than 16, then you don't have to worry about that. You can go up from 16 to 22. They could be in together. So that's an objective factor. However, there are no chronological age range limitations for students in the 1213. So keep track of all this. But so yeah, you could potentially have, a big range. But again, you might get in on a big range, but you still have the other. You could have a 10-year-old and a 20-year-old in a 1213, but they still have to meet these other requirements here. So you got your age range to consider. Now let's talk about variances. You can ask SED for a variance for 2 things. For class size, make that 611 a 711, or age range. You can go beyond the 36 months that we talked about. You have to make your requests based on documented educational justification. And the variances may not be granted at the start of the year, which is weird. So you have to let the kids sit home. Okay, it's October, and you make it, which is kind of frustrating, but that's the rule. Now, if you don't, we don't have a lot of huge districts around here, but there are some wonky rules in big districts for variances about limitations and so on. But for most schools, if your population is less than 125,000, if you're a city school district, so if you're in a very large district, you want to find out the limitations and variances for yours. However, for smaller school districts with a population of less than 125,000, the special class size for middle and secondary students following a variance may not exceed 20% of the typical limit. That's why you can make your 611 a 711, but you can't make it an 811 because you're going to go for those math majors out there. That will get you from 16% to 33%. So, but that's a little limitation in there. A few other issues. Reading and math levels. This comes up. So each district operating a special class where in the range of achievement levels in reading and math, if it exceeds 3 years, let's forget the except for a minute. But it says here, special classes, if your math and reading levels exceed 3 years, what do you have to do? Does the class get broken up? Do you throw someone out? No. All you have to do though is tell the parent that you're in excess of 3 years. So now. So I think this is an important one because I think people don't understand this rule. So you've got this 36-month reading and math rule. So in theory, you should know your test scores in reading and math of your kids, and you see where they are. Now, which test score do you use? Do you use your assessment? That's a good one. Do you use a star? That's a good one. Who knows? But so it doesn't explain that. Now, This does not apply in 611, 811, and 1213. Very significant. So that's a lot of the placements. So this will only apply for 15-1 and 1211. So for 15-1 and 1211, the kids should have math and English levels within 36 months. If they don't, you have to give them notice, and they have an opportunity to discuss the description with the parent. Is this an automatic FAPE denial? I don't think so. I don't know. The only time I heard this rule even being mentioned is in a class action settlement like 25 years ago. So I don't think people know this rule. I don't think they follow it. I don't think it's a FAPE denial. I don't think it is. It's very narrow circumstances. But if someone ever brings this up, just know the universe within which we're living. A few more very quick ones. Parent counseling. Parents of students in 611, 811, and 1213, they're automatically entitled to parent counseling. They might have gotten it anyway, and I think parents of students with autism, they get it too automatically, and so there might be some crossover, but parents of students in these three special classes get it automatically. Is it a FAPE denial if you don't give it? This case law says it's not automatically, but it's good to know the rules. Lastly, extended school year services. Another very, very weird rule that it's not 100% clear what it means. So, for extended school year services, we all know it's the substantial regression test, which is we need actual proof that the student's going to substantially regress after the summer without services in order for them to be entitled to extended school year services. And it's a high standard. They need to exhibit the need for this. You need data. It's hard. You know, how do you do this? You always hear Ann talk about collecting data. What do you do? How did the student do after winter break, after spring break, after Thanksgiving? They fall behind. Stuff like that's relevant. So if a parent asks for for ESY and we don't have data, we're in strong grounds to say, no, not yet. We'll keep an eye on it for next year. However, the regs are kind of strange because it says, despite the previous standard, which says you really need to prove this, there's a section in the regs, 200.6 K1, which says CSEs, so it says 5 groups of students shall be considered for 12-month special services and their programs in accordance with their need to prevent substantial regression. And the 5 groups are students in 611, 811, 1213, home and hospital instruction, and students placed in a 7-day residential program. So you got that group of kids. Do they get automatically get ESY? It doesn't say that. It says these groups shall be considered for 12-month service. Shouldn't everyone be considered subject to, and again, shall be considered in accordance with their need to prevent substantial regression? This is not very clear. You could argue this both ways. You could say, I know it mentions these groups, but it still says in accordance with their need to prevent substantial regression. So nothing's different, and we're going to figure out the data. On the other hand, you could say, Well, they listed them. It's got to mean something. Why would they list them if they're just like everybody else? So this is just my take on it. And it's not, and this is what I come up with is I would presume those other kids are going to get ESY unless the data says otherwise. And I'm like, what is that? Some lawyer double talk BS, which it is. But I mean, if we're going to deny them, I want to come with some data supporting that, because we are looking at language that's going to be, pressuring us to do it. So that's my take on it. And that's all we have for special. Oh, question. Yes. Yeah. Great.
So I recently have had a parent share with me for ascended school year that when parents are declining it and choosing to do other programs, the state is saying that they will no longer get Medicaid reimbursed for that. And that they will be reaching out to districts to see who's recommending ESY. And then parents are now asking me to not put a recommendation of ESY on an IEP.
Wait, so
So they are choosing to maybe do some other camps
Okay.
or whatever, and they have self-directed and they
Okay.
can get a reimbursement for that. But the state is now saying if the district has recommended ESY,
Oh,
you can still do those camps, but the parents won't get the reimbursement.
wow. I've never, that's really,
You guys haven't heard that yet? I can share with you the email she sent me about it.
wow, that's,
No, I'm not, I believe you. You don't have to share it. I don't think that's a reason to not put ESY on the IEP because sorry, Jeff.
yeah, no, it's all right. Yeah,
You-
yeah, it's all right.
I can't help myself. You still have an obligation to provide a FAPE. And if you don't put ESY as a recommendation on the IEP, they can turn around and initiate due process, and it's not a legal justification to say it's not on there because they asked for it to be taken off. So it's a risk to not put it
Yeah.
on there.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I agree because we own the IEP. Interesting, the parent could refuse. Like ESY is one of those, usually consent is all or nothing, but ESY is they can essentially decline it or not consent to it. But I do think there is value to keeping it on the IEP, because if it's not, then we're exposed. Was that a question? Yeah.
Wait, okay.
So I know we focused a lot on the criteria for eligibility,
Mhm.
but if we move into the high school settings and the highly qualified teachers, and how do we figure out how to get that done in your 1201 classrooms? Because I know like Arbosis does it. I know they're not highly qualified teachers. I don't know how do we deal with that when it comes to diploma and stuff like that?
And you got that?
I don't
no,
I
no.
really answer.
Well, I mean, the thing is, that's a whole that we could do a 3-hour program on who's certified to teach special classes and all the exceptions and so on. All I could say is it's brutal, and there are probably lots of unqualified or inappropriately certified people teaching that. It's also a good argument on, because what comes up with special classes is they'll have a student who is a 611 student, and the parent will say, why don't you have this 611? Why are you recommending BOCES? They could fit in fine. They could have lunch. They can go to gym. Why can't now? What we say to that is, one, there's no law that requires us to create classes under those circumstances. And we could end the conversation right there. But if we wanted to, we could also say, because we don't have kids to fill every one of those options. But on top of that, we don't have staff either. And so that is another reason why the sort of collaborative, like the BOCES approach of, I mean, that's, if there's one teacher with that qualification, ideally they're in a position where the few kids from lots of districts, several, are going to meet with him or her. So yeah, if we don't have it, we don't have it.
Okay, we have a couple of questions. There's a question, don't students automatically get parent counseling and training for 1211s?
Okay, great. The answer is, let's go back to no, the answer is no, they don't. They automatically get it for 611, 811, and 1213. Now, whoever wrote this, you have to, there's a section of parent, it cross-references another section, which cross-references another section. So it's easy to confuse a 1211 and a 1213. But the answer is no, they're not automatically, but they might get it because the parents just need it.
Right, or if the student has autism
Yeah,
or something.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
The other question is similar to the one we already had. If parents do not want ESY, the CSE chair in our district often checks no on the IEP. Shouldn't it still say yes and then parents declined? Yes. If we think that the student needs ESY, I'm sorry, this is
Yeah.
something I feel.
Oh, yeah, sure.
If we think that a student needs ESY, it needs to be on the IEP. Like Jeff said before, it's not compulsory. Parents aren't required to send their child to ESY, and we can share that with them, that we're recommending it. It's your choice if they attend or not. But the recommendation is to stay on the IEP, and then the parents decide what they want to do from there, is my suggestion.
Yeah, because they'll remember when it's litigation. So the parent might have at that meeting not had an attorney, and the parent said, I don't need it. Just take it off. And we're working with the parent. Parent gets a lawyer. The lawyer's thinking, I have to win. I have to win on one case, one issue to get paid. So I'm coming after everything. And if I don't see ESY, that seems like an easy one.
Yeah, that brings up a bigger issue, which is in CSE, we always have to think about collaborating and compromising. If we didn't do that as CSE chairs, we would be in hearings every day, right? That's part of the art of the CSE. There's nothing in the law that says that. The law says we have an obligation to recommend a FAPE in the least restrictive environment, regardless of what the parent wants. And the law actually says it's not a defense to say, but the parent didn't want it. With that said, we are always thinking of ways to collaborate and compromise, but you need to think in the back of your head that if the parent changes their mind, not just for ESY, for anything, if the parent says, I don't want speech, and so we don't put speech on the IEP, and then the parent initiates due process and says speech should have been on the IEP, it's not a defense to say the parent didn't want it. So that's just something we should be thinking about as we're developing IEPs and taking the parents' concerns into consideration.
Yeah,
I'm not saying to never compromise. I'm not saying that, but just something to think about.
And as Anne's walking back, yeah, I mean, from a litigation perspective, we've seen though, what happens is if we do what the parent wants, there'll be a FAPE denial, and it's going to be a FAPE denial. The only thing we could do at hearing is argue, well, you shouldn't get compensatory services because the equities, because we did what you wanted, so you shouldn't get a windfall from that. And there's different views on, it's not a good place to be. You'd rather win on the FAPE issue than, be this much closer to the cliff, falling back, saying, well, okay, maybe it's a FAPE denial, but you shouldn't get extra services for it.
What about earlier, Jeff, when you said that when a parent signs consent, it's for all or nothing? So what if a parent wants, there's a recommendation for speech or recommendation for resource room, but the parent does not want just those things, but wants co-taught classes or whatnot? Okay,
so, but yeah, the rule is it's all or nothing. It's in general. So the ESY is an exception because it's not compulsory. And also parents who are in non-pubs can, quote, request some, but not all.
And homeschool too.
And homeschool
So
too.
IESPs.
Yeah.
And
But-
it's not necessarily like a partial consent. They have to make a request. I'm just because they have to make a request by June 1st of the preceding year saying these are the services I want next year.
Exactly. But for if it's, let's say, September to June, and the district thinks it should be, CT, resource room, and 3 related services, the parent cannot say, I'm only giving partial consent. It's all or nothing. Now,
Same for evaluations. We covered that last
Yep.
time.
Yep. Now, the thing is, it's possible that what the regs say and the guidance is you can allow partial consent by removing something from an IEP if it's not needed for a FAPE. So why would it have been recommended in the first place if it wasn't needed for a FAPE? Now, look, from a practical standpoint, sure, it's just a risk. And if you say, I don't need the headache and working well with his family, and you agree to take it out and you put in the paperwork, we were going to recommend it, but we didn't because the parent, it happens. It happens a lot. And it's possible 9 out of 10 times you're fine. 99 out of 100, maybe you're fine. I don't know. But legally, we're not fine. We own that IEP. And so we've seen it, the parents that can ask for it on Monday and challenge it on Tuesday, and they'll say, I'm just a parent. You have all the PhDs and masters. How did I know? You should have talked me out of it. So,
We have another question.
yeah.
So just to clarify, in our meeting minutes, we have a little blurb at the end for our 6s, our 8s, and our 12-1-3s that says, parent counseling and training was offered, but denied by the parent. So that is not enough. We have to put like a one-time PC&T on there, even if the parent denies it. Is that what you're saying?
That's interesting.
Can I answer that?
Yeah, sure.
There's no downside to putting it on the IEP. There's no downside. Just document that they're not coming and that it was available to them. That's my thought.
Yeah, because right. It's possible. Yeah, parent counseling, that's certainly not compulsory. You can't force the parent. The more you put in to show what we recommended, the better. All right. Great questions. All right, so we're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we'll be back at about 10:26. Thank you. No, it was great. It was great. Yes.
Oh, it's inside. Okay.
Sure.
Okay, everybody, we'll get started with the second half. Slowly quieting down. It's good. All right. All right. Hope everybody had a good break. Hello to everybody online. Happy Cinco de Mayo. Go Sabres, of course. Round 2 tomorrow, game 1. Here we go. All right. So great topic. Everything you need to know about pattern determinations. I've already been given the heads up by Anne that she's got a lot to say about this. So that's okay. You may hear from her again. She's the right person for this, our resident school psychologist on our staff. So we thought this was a good topic to do. There's generally a lot of confusion about pattern determinations, when to do it, how to do it, who has to do it. So we thought this would be a timely topic. So here we go. Let's dive into pattern determinations. And at the end of this, by the way, we'll have a couple different scenarios and you get to be the judge. So that'll be fine. I won't make you raise your hand and tell the answer, but be a good little exercise for us. All right. So to frame our discussion, it's good to go back to basics for a little bit. So what are we talking about here? All right. So we're in the world of manifestation determination review. So under the IDA and also, of course, Section 504, manifestation determination is the process of determining whether a student's disability is related to his or her misconduct. So student with a disability does something bad at school. We're looking at a possible suspension. There are certain they get certain protections, of course, when it exceeds a certain number of days. So that's the world we're living in. All right. So what are we talking about? So if obviously these are things that we know. So if we find manifestation, we can't suspend. The suspension's over. They go back to their placement if we find a manifestation of their disability. So when do we do this? All right. This topic is about when do we do the manifestation determination review. So there are basically 2 paths to that process. We know the typical process, the one that sort of plays out on its own, the easiest to think about is, where a student gets suspended and they go to superintendent's hearing, they're found guilty, we pause and we do the manifestation determination review there. If they're found guilty, yes or no, can we go forward with the suspension? The other one that's going to be our focus today is when it's not as clear cut. So students suspended 2 days here, 3 days there, then, they make it maybe another couple of months and they get suspended again. Okay. Then we want to take a look at those. So 10 or more non-consecutive days to see if that pattern of see if that kind of constitutes a pattern. All right. So that's our focus. All right. So a manifestation determination review is required whenever we're thinking about a suspension could result in a disciplinary change in placement. So that is a suspension or removal from a student's current education placement that is either, again, more than 10 consecutive school days, all right, that's an easy one, or 10 consecutive school days or less if the student is subjected to a series of suspensions or removals that constitute a pattern. All right, so what are the factors that that constitute a pattern? So if the removals accumulate to more than 10 school days in a year, the behavior is substantially similar to behavior in previous incidents that resulted in the series of removals, and 3 additional factors like the length of each suspension or removal, the total time the student has been removed, and the proximity of the suspensions or removals to one another. So again, our focus is when it's the pattern. So there's confusion about this. All right. We've heard of some instances where some people are doing the pattern determination at the manifestation review meeting. Okay. That's not what we're talking about. So the pattern determination happens to decide whether or not you're going to manifestation determination review. Okay. So that happens before you get there. After you do the pattern determination, you may need to go to manifestation, you may not. Okay. But that's the point of the pattern determination. All right. So we're going to talk about each of those factors in detail. All right. But let's talk about some definitions. So Like I said, so a pattern can be if you got to do this if you have 10 consecutive school days or less, if the student is subjected to a series of suspensions or removals that constitute a pattern. So the regulations define some of these terms. So what is a day? All right, a day is defined as any day, including a partial day, that students are in attendance at school for instructional purposes. Okay, so any day, it includes a partial day. All right, now a partial day is not defined in the regulations. So if they're there for a half day, that probably counts. All right, we generally take a pretty conservative view of this. You know, we want to be erring on the side of caution. And we'll talk about like that comes up in the next contest too. So what is a removal? All right, when we talk about ISS, so a removal is a removal of a student with a disability for disciplinary reasons from the student's current educational placement, other than a suspension and the change in placement of a student with a disability to an IES by an impartial hearing officer. So when you're taking the student out of their current educational placement, that's a removal. So if a student is acting up and needs to be taken out of class for a couple periods, is that a removal? Probably. All right. If they need to be sent home, they're not suspended, but let's say, Johnny's having a really tough day. We think it would be best if you just come and get him. Is that a removal? Yes. Okay. We generally say, yes, that is a removal for purposes of counting whether or not we have to do the pattern determination.
Andrew, I'm jumping in.
Sure.
I agree with everything you just said. With the caveat that it's for disciplinary purposes. So if a student's going out of class to meet with the counselor to use coping skills to calm down, or maybe going to a room to kind of use some sensory activities or something like that, if it's not for disciplinary reasons, I think you can say that's different. That's not a removal because that's an intervention. Even better if there's something on the IEP or the BIP about that, that would be implementing their IEP. But if it's for disciplinary reasons, then that would count. And the commissioner has said that there is no ability to just send a student home without processing it as a suspension. And I know that it seems very child-centered to call a parent and say they're having a rough day. Why don't you just come get them? Let's have a reset tomorrow. From a legal perspective, that is a suspension, and you need to follow all of the procedures for a suspension to do that. But even if you don't, it still counts as a removal. Because the student is out of their placement, arguably for disciplinary reasons.
Thank you. All right. So an in-school suspension, what about that? Is that a removal? So an in-school suspension or any other disciplinary removal of a student from that student's program likely counts as a removal. Okay. And here's why. So the U.S. Department of Education, OCR, Office for Civil Rights, has directed that an in-school suspension should be considered a suspension for the purposes of a pattern determination unless the nature and quality of the educational services provided during the suspension is comparable to the nature and quality of education previously provided. So under this standard, the setting for the in-school suspension should be compared to what their regular placement is. Now, most of the times that's probably not going to look very similar. So, if it is, great. But I think in most cases, it's probably not. So generally, we advise that, if a student's going to ISS, they're not going home, they're suspended, it's ISS, that still counts as a removal for purposes of counting the number of removals towards whether or not you have to do a pattern determination. Okay. Here we go. Okay. So relevant timeframes, the removals are counted within the same school year. So we get this question a lot. The clock does not reset once you do a manifestation determination review meeting in the same school year, or once you conduct a pattern determination, the clock resets the following year. So every removal during that school year counts whenever the student has been removed beyond those 10 non-consecutive days or for 10 consecutive days. The clock does not reset. Pretty straightforward. Okay. A couple additional basics. So again, this does apply to Section 504 students and also students who are presumed to have a disability. They're also entitled to manifestation determination review. So you may have to do a pattern determination when it comes to these students. So just a reminder, these are students whose, if the parent of the student has expressed concern in writing to the district that the child is in need of special education, the parent of the student requested a CSE or Section 504 evaluation, or a teacher of the student or other personnel of the district expressed specific concerns about a pattern of behavior demonstrated by the student, directly to the director of special education of the district or to other supervisory personnel. That's pretty broad. So I would probably say like your building administrator likely counts as that. Now, there are some exceptions to this. I'll just go through quickly. The parent of the student. So students are not, they do not get manifestation, determination, review protection. If they, let's say they meet, let's see, can you see that? Let's see, they meet these 3 factors, but they don't count still if the parent of the student has not allowed the CSE to evaluate, that they've refused special education services. So you've gone through the evaluation process and they decline to go forward, or if it was determined that the student was ineligible. So those are students who are no longer presumed to have a disability. They can be suspended as if any, you know, let's say you get a referral, you evaluate, the parent declines. Well, that student can be suspended like any other student now. All right. Yes, the CSE found him eligible, but the parent declined. They are not presumed to have a disability for purposes of manifestation review. All right, timelines. So, of course, I mean, it makes sense ideally to conduct these immediately if possible. The regs say, the law says no later than 10 school days after the decision to suspend is made. You know, when you read that, it reads as though like you can, let's say they get to the 10th day and you want to suspend them longer. They go through a hearing and then the superintendent decides to spend an additional day. You read that and you would think, oh, okay, as long as we do the MDR within the next 10 days, we're fine. That's a trap. All right. I don't know that anybody really goes about their business that way. So, and especially, like, I mean, if you're at a superintendent's hearing and the student is guilty and they're contemplating a suspension beyond 10 days, or that would get you, you know, let's say we're contemplating 6 months, you got to go to that manifestation determination review after that guilty phase or guilt and innocent phase. That's all I'll say about that. All right. So we just talked about when the MDR would come up in a superintendent's hearing. So generally, you know, the superintendent's hearing has to be conducted within a certain amount of time, within 5 days of placing the student on a short term. So that's, you know, usually when, you know, you're all used to this. We hold, you know, we do the superintendent's hearing, then guilty or innocent, then we go to the MDR. We have the MDR meeting. Is it direct and substantially connected? Yes. Okay, then kid goes back, or no, we can go forward. But that's just a review. Okay, so here we go into the nitty gritty. Pattern determinations. So again, these should occur when a series of short-term removals add up to more than 10 non-consecutive days. So we're talking about a situation where a student gets suspended 2 days in October, 3 days in December, again in February, then again in March. Okay. Once you get to those 10 non-consecutive days and you want to go past that, you got to do a pattern determination. All right. So this is a case-by-case analysis. You know, everything not, you know, as everything else is in special education, it's individualized. We have to take these as they come to us. So you're going to examine, and we're going to talk about each of these factors, whether there are similarities between the misconduct in question, the length of the previous suspensions, removals, the total amount of time they've been suspended, and the time proximity of the suspensions removal. How close in time were these instances of misconduct? So you're going to see that there's kind of really only 2 factors that matter. It's really the similarity of the behavior and how close in time do these incidents occur. Yes, we want to consider those other ones, but those 2, the similarities of the behavior and how close these incidents occurred in time, are 2 that are weighted the heaviest by far. All right. Excuse me for 1 second. All right. Again, to emphasize, so you're doing the pattern determination before you get to the manifestation determination review meeting. If no pattern is found, you're looking at all Johnny's incidents throughout the year and you find that there's no pattern, there is no need to conduct a manifestation determination review. It can be suspended. If a pattern is found, then obviously the opposite is true. You can't impose the suspension and you have to go to the manifestation. You have to hold a manifestation review meeting and you have to find that there is no nexus if you want to suspend. If there is a nexus, then we know what happens. They go back to their placement. So who does this? There's no rules on who has to conduct or who must or who should conduct the pattern determination. It makes sense in our mind that, it can be done by one person. It could be done by a team of people who know the student. Probably best practice to at least involve your school psychologist for sure. But I mean, could it be the principal? Could be. I mean, there's nothing that says it can't be. But generally, we'd recommend, at least having a school psychologist and maybe a team of folks. I'm not saying you have to invite the whole CSE, but the school psychologist and maybe a teacher, maybe principal. I'm not, but long story short, there's no rules, but it should be somebody familiar with the student. All right. We wouldn't want to pull in somebody from a different, obviously it makes no sense. All right. So the pattern determination should be documented. This can be done through a checklist or a standard form. We've developed a form and a checklist, I think maybe even as recently as this year. But the reason that's important is because parents have a right to challenge whether or not there was a pattern. So parents can challenge a pattern determination result in a due process hearing. So, we could have school psychologists come and testify, yes, I did this, but it's obviously better, if we can produce a piece of paper that says that we did this. Okay. Oh, Colleen Schaefer raised her hand. All right, we'll get to you, Colleen. Yes. Oh, that's just online. Yeah, it's just online. Sorry. Not like in real life. Yeah, you can type in your question and we'll get to it. Okay. So the parent is not entitled to participate in the pattern determination. Okay. And although not expressly, there's no rule that says that we have to do this, but we should, for the same reason that we should document it, we should inform the parent as a best practice what the result of the pattern determination was. Now, there's no form, it doesn't have to go in a PWN. You could do that. You could do it in a letter. There's nothing that even says you have to do this, but we're recommending that you do, just because it's consistent with prior written notice requirements, it's consistent with due process, and because the parents have the right to challenge it in a due process hearing, it's just a good practice to give them notice of what the determination was. Okay, so now we get to the fun part of actually using our brains and deciding whether or not this is a pattern. So like I mentioned before, the primary factor is going to be whether the student's most recent misconduct is substantially similar to behavior in the previous incidents. So we're looking at the suspension that is right before us, and we're comparing the misconduct that led to that proposed suspension to what happened in the past. Okay. So what are we going to consider when we just, we don't just have to consider similarity of behavior. All right. So if we're talking about, let's say the student just got into a fight, we're going to look at past behavior, see if there are other fights. Okay. But, we can consider the location. Where was the fight? The day of the week, the time of the day, what other individuals were present, what was the triggering event, what was the class setting. So we can consider all of those things. Now, not all of those things are necessarily going to be weighted equally. Obviously, I think the type of behavior, but let's say, student was suspended for, earlier in the year fighting student A, 3 months later, he pushes student A again, okay, into the locker and he closes the door. All right, well, we have, similarities there. Not saying that's a pattern, could be not. But when we're talking about considering the similarity of behavior, let's say the first removal was for fighting, second removal swore at a teacher. Then he got ISS for that. And the third, he got caught possessing marijuana. So similarities, probably not. Okay. So that's the first thing that we look at. And as I mentioned earlier, the next weightiest factor is going to be the proximity of the suspensions to each other. And for this, the case law says if it's within 4 months, that's the rough cutoff. Now, I'm saying that's a hard and fast, bright line rule, but generally within 4 months. If it's beyond 4 months, maybe not. Maybe not. Less likely that it will be a pattern. Okay. And then there's other factors, the length of each suspension, were they 2 days? Those to us just, yes, consider them. But as I said, the similarity of behavior and the proximity of these incidents together are by far the most important. Okay. So let's take a look at some examples. All right. In September, here's number one, September 26th. In September, early first thing in the school year, the student is suspended 5 days for vaping THC. You'll see this kid is a true Renaissance man. All right. In October 26, 2026, the student is suspended 5 days for fighting. Okay, so we got vaping and we got fighting. Are we at the 10 days? All right, so we're at 10. Now in November 2026, entrepreneurial spirit, student is caught running a craps game backstage in the auditorium. This kid is 12, by the way. So he's had a lot of worldly experience. All right. So what do we think? First factor, similarity of behavior, fighting, vaping THC, craps game backstage. And by the way, parents all blame this on ADHD, right? Of course. Could be. You never know. Well, I don't know about the craps game. That takes some. You got to bring the cards and the dice and the money. Anyway, so behavior similar? Yes, no. I think I'll agree. Okay, proximity in time. September, October, November. Yes. Okay, but look at this. Look at I mean, what are we going to weigh most here? The pattern of the behavior is different. Okay, so probably we would say that there's no pattern here. I can think we all safely say that. Okay, and nobody disagrees. That's a good sign. Jeff said yes. Well, I'm going to overrule Jeff. All right. So number two. All right. If you said it's a pattern, no biggie. So what happens if you said it's a pattern? Then what? Manifestation determination review. Okay. All right. Scenario number two. All right. Here we go. More consistent. Not as much of a varied pattern here. Okay. So November, student is suspended 5 days for fighting. All right. Then we have some time go by. He's a good citizen. Then in February 2026, the student is suspended 5 days for throwing a chair across the room, swearing at a teacher. All right. So let's think about that. We're at 5 days. Okay. 10. We do something else again. All right. Those are non-consecutive days. We're looking at whether or not we have to do a pattern determination or whether or not, yeah, you know what I mean. So in March 2026, very next month, student shoves another student in the locker room during PE, not gym, PE, causing him to bang his head. The principal wants to suspend the student for 3 days. All right. So again, similar behavior. Okay. We got fighting, throwing a chair, then shoving a student. Say that falls under the umbrella of aggressive, violent, potentially. Yes, violent. So I would say yes to the similarity of behavior. All right. Now, what about the proximity in time? We went from November to February. Is that within our 4-month period? Okay. Yes. And then February to March, we're looking at 1 month. All right. So this is a little bit easier of an example, but this is the analysis that we go through. Okay. So in this case, we probably say, yeah, there's a pattern here. Let's go to manifestation determination review before we can suspend. Okay. All right. And lastly, all right. September 2026, the student is suspended 5 days for fighting on the bus. Okay. In December, the student is suspended 5 days for fighting in lunch. 2 different locations, maybe relevant, maybe not. Now we go from December all the way until May. That's pretty good. The student throws his backpack at the student he fought in December, hitting him in the head. Principal wants to suspend for 3 days. I don't know if that's typical length of time, but here we are. Okay, so let's go through the factors. Number 1, similarity of behavior. Fighting, throwing his backpack. Some say yes, some say no. I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. Okay, what about the proximity in time? September to December, that's well within the 4-month period, right? Okay, we got 2 instances of fighting within 3 months. Okay, alarm bells are ringing potentially. And then we go all the way to May. That's 5 months. What do we think? You don't have to, I mean, reasonable people could disagree here about this one. This is not a clear-cut case. I think generally we would say that 4-month period. Now, what would an IHO think? That's the approach we take. All right. Could we convince an IHO that this is not? Now, there's case law that says within 4 months. There's probably case law that says 5 months isn't that much different. So on the abundance of caution side of the conservative approach would say it's probably a pattern. You're safer doing a pattern determination, or you're safer finding a pattern and going to MDR. Now, there's other considerations you might take into account. Maybe maybe this is a kid with dyslexia, and that you're not going to find a nexus. All right, there's no nexus and it depends. Maybe there's a lot of pressure from teachers unions to get this kid out of the building. I don't know. Maybe he's doing other things. Those are things that you have to talk through. But on paper, this is probably one that you would go to manifestation determination review. And in some cases, you're better off doing that. If it's not a nexus, it's not a nexus. If it's a nexus, it's a nexus. But probably better off finding a pattern here and going to MDR. So that's all I have.
Thank you. I got a question on the hotline, right to my direct facts. So, okay. Okay, Andrew, if a student, it's like remember those game shows? Remember guess my, let's make a deal okay. Yes, 80s. That's right. Okay.
It's a mystery date.
Yes. Okay. If a student has already been suspended 10 times and you have had a manifestation meeting already and they are suspended an 11th time for something totally unrelated, do we have to hold a manifestation meeting prior to the suspension? For example, the first 10 times were cell phone violations and insubordination. The 11th would be for vaping.
Well, if you're going to the 10th time, you're going beyond it. You're looking to propose a suspension that goes beyond 10 days. And this is a non-consecutive?
Yes.
Okay, then you would hold a pattern determination and decide, is it a pattern? If it's not a pattern, then you don't have to go to manifestation. But you have to do that pattern determination and document it and give notice to the parent. That's what I would say.
I'm also wondering why you've already had a manifest, because you get 10 free days.
Right.
So take
Right.
them.
Right.
Well, maybe the first 5 were superintendent's hearing.
Maybe they were,
Yeah.
although if we know that it's not going to be longer than 10 days, we don't have to hold the manifest, but arguably we wouldn't know that, right? Because we don't
Right,
know until
right.
the superintendent issues their decision.
But based on the conduct, so we don't know the time, but we know the time, we know cell phone abuse, insubordination, and vaping. It doesn't sound like probably not a pattern.
Probably not.
It's just similar.
Probably not.
One thing on patterns, one kind of the insubordination comment's interesting. Like when you're doing your pattern list, you try to avoid the general descriptions in the code of conduct, like insubordination or disorderly conduct, and focus on the actual conduct. Because you're less likely to find a pattern when anything could be insubordination.
Right.
Um,
Those categories are very broad and they encompass a lot. When you're talking about endangering the health and safety of, just look at your categories of code of conduct violations. I mean, encompasses a lot of different types of behavior. So. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ann McGinnis, and I love special education. I can't help myself. Okay, I'm going to finish us off with evaluations, and I know that we are going to be done at 11:30, so buckle up. We're going to get it done, okay? But I'm not going to do it at the expense of the content, okay? So whenever there's an initial eligibility evaluation through CSE, we know there are some evaluations that have to automatically be included. That's a physical examination. Sometimes we call that a medical evaluation, a social history, an observation of the student and the student's learning environment, and then other appropriate assessments or evaluations. We also have to do an individual psychological evaluation unless the school psychologist determines that further evaluation is unnecessary. I do not like that option. There is no downside to doing more evaluations. There's no downside to collecting more data. So when in doubt, collect more data. There's some questions about what has to go in a psych eval. Sometimes people think they automatically have to include a cognitive and achievement. There's nothing in the law that says that, actually. Might it be best practice? Some people might argue that it is. Ultimately, what goes into any evaluation we do has to be based on the referral reason and what we think might be the underlying suspected disability. So if we have concerns about anxiety, we have to make sure our psychological evaluation includes assessment in anxiety. Could cognitive and achievement be helpful in kind of identifying where the student is performing and where we would expect them to perform? Sure, it could be helpful, and maybe you're going to include that too. I'm not saying not to. I always did. That's not saying that's the right thing to do. But we have to make sure the evaluation specifically identifies, specifically addresses the areas of suspected disability. And we have to make sure that the PWN identifies that when we're asking for parent consent. So it's not sufficient to say a psychological evaluation that could include cognitive achievement, adaptive behavior, executive functioning, social emotional. That's not sufficient. We have to say what areas we are proposing for this particular student, a psychological evaluation to include cognitive achievement and social emotional testing, if that's what we're doing for the student. You don't have to say the specific evaluations that you're giving, the specific assessments, but you have to say the areas that you're proposing for this individual student. And when we talk about assessing in all areas of suspected disability, that includes the areas of concern raised by the parent. So again, there's no downside to doing an assessment, even if we don't think that the student has a need in that area. This comes up with functional behavioral assessments sometimes, and teams will push back for initials and say, we really don't see any underlying behaviors. And I say, great, do it. And then when you go to CSE, the data is going to show that there are no behaviors that warrant a BIP. It just bolsters your position. Or maybe you'll find something. I guess we should be open to that. Now, for reevaluations, after the student is identified, we can say no to a parent's request for an evaluation. If we do that, we have to put it in a prior written notice letter and explain the reason for why we're saying no. But again, there's no downside to collecting more data. So it should be very rare that we say no. We're always in a better position to defend our decisions if we have that evaluative data to support that decision. So maybe if we just did a full speech eval in all areas and a parent a month later asks for the exact same thing, maybe that's a situation where we would say no, but the default should typically be to say yes, conduct the evaluation, and then let the CSE review to decide what to do. And, you'll see like things like OT, speech, physical therapy, they're not required evaluations, but if that's part of the referral reason, we should include those in the initial as well. We know that we are supposed to reevaluate a student at least once every 3 years, unless the district and parent agree in writing that it's not necessary. Again, this always makes me nervous when we bypass a reevaluation and the student kind of continues on their way, because the more information and data we have, the stronger position we're in to defend. But that is permissible. I would just be careful not to do that repeatedly. not to push off the reevaluation repeatedly. We also are not required to evaluate more frequently than once per year unless we agree, the district and the parent agree that there's a need to evaluate more than once per year. So who conducts the evaluations? The multidisciplinary team or a group of people, including at least one teacher or other specialist with knowledge in the area of the student's disability. So the CSE is a multidisciplinary team. Some CSEs take all the evaluations and put them in one multidisciplinary evaluation report. That's not as common in this area as maybe in other states, but some do that. That's okay. And it's signed off by everybody who conducted portions of the evaluation. Others do their actual evaluation in a separate report, and then the CSE reviews all of those. Both of those are fine. Who determines the scope of the evaluation or the reevaluation? The regs say a group that includes the CSE and other qualified professionals determine if additional evaluative data is needed to determine if the student, oh, this is for declassification. Okay, let's talk about declass. So for declassification, there's a couple of rules. In general, the CSE, if we're considering declassification, the CSE should convene and have a conversation with the parent saying, you know what, it looks like they are making progress toward their goals. I think that we might be considering declassification. Does anybody here think there's a need for an evaluation? And if anybody does, we should do a reevaluation of that student. If the team doesn't think that, we still have to let the parent know that they have the right to request a reevaluation. And then we convene the CSE and then we make a declassification decision considering any information we collected. Again, if there's any kind of disagreement on the parent's part, it's always a stronger position to do that evaluation before we declassify, even if we don't think that's necessary. More data is always better. All right, let's move on to IEEs. So an independent educational evaluation is an individual evaluation of a student with a disability or a student who is thought to have a disability conducted by somebody who is not an employee of the district. And it's at public, if it's at public expense, the criteria used for that evaluation has to be the same criteria we use for our own evaluation. We're going to break that down a little bit. Parents have a right to request one IEE at public expense each time the school district conducts an evaluation with which the parent disagrees. So the only thing the parent needs to be entitled to an evaluation is to say, I disagree with this evaluation, I want an IEE. And if they do that, they've met the criteria for an IEE and the district has to respond accordingly, which we're going to talk about. So if the parent requests, we have to give them information about where an IEE can be obtained and the school district's criteria for IEEs, including the location, the qualifications of the examiner, and also fees. We're going to talk about all of those individually because that comes up a lot with different IEE requests. We can't impose any additional conditions or timelines on the parent obtaining an IEE at public expense. This means that it's funded by the district. That's what a public expense means. And the district cannot require that the parent gives a reason for why they disagree. We can ask them, why do you disagree? But if we ask them that, we have to say you're not required to give us an answer. We can't require that. There are only 2 permitted responses to an IEE, which I think many school folks feel is unfair. And I understand that. So I'm just going to validate that feeling. But there's only 2 permitted responses. 1 is to ensure that the IEE is provided at public expense. And 2 is to initiate an impartial hearing to say that they're not entitled to it. We can't say no. We can't say, we'll only pay up to this amount because that's our criteria and you're responsible for the rest. We can't say that unless we initiate a due process hearing. Those are our only options. If we don't want to say yes to whatever they're asking, we need to initiate due process. Initiating due process requires the authorization from the Board of Education. And we also need to make sure that all of our procedures are up to date and accurate under the law. IEE law is always changing. And as it's changing, it's always becoming more parent friendly. And so we have to make sure we're ready to go. And to be frank, the cost of initiating due process will probably far outweigh the cost of funding the IEE. So sometimes districts do initiate due process for this purpose. It's rare. It may be in situations where maybe districts are getting a lot of requests from the same evaluator that the district has concerns about that evaluator's credentials or fees. You know, there might be a bigger reason for that. But it is rare that districts initiate due process to challenge an IEE. But just to be clear, we can't say no unless we initiate due process. Another reason that we would initiate due process is to prove that our evaluation is appropriate and that the parent's not entitled to an IEE for that reason. The burden is on the district when we initiate due process to prove that the parent is not entitled for an IEE for whatever that reason might be. Okay, so there was an exception in New York State that said that parents are not entitled to an IEE in an area that the district did not yet evaluate. So let's say the parent asks for a central auditory processing disorder of IEE, and we've never evaluated in that area. It used to be that we could say, well, we need to do that first before you're entitled to that. This exception is going away, and I'm going to walk you through what's happened over the past few years. So there was, in 2015, right around the time that I came here, there was a letter from the United States Department of Education's Office of Special Education Programs, OSEP, that's from the Federal Education Department, called Letter to BOUS. And it advised in that letter that a parent of a student with a disability could request an IEE at public expense, even if it was an area that was not previously evaluated by the district. So in that example I gave about the central auditory processing disorder evaluation, under Letter to BOUS, this federal guidance letter, not law, federal interpretation of federal law, is that if we haven't evaluated in that area, the parent could still be entitled to that, even if we haven't done our own evaluation first. And in New York State, we have had some decisions recently that have explicitly adopted Letter to BOUS. And for many years after Letter to BOUS came out, that didn't happen. And so we wouldn't comply with that because it was not our law in New York State. But since then, we have some decisions that have adopted that through the SRO. That's the first level of appeal after a due process hearing. That's the state review officer through the state education department. And SRO decisions do establish law because they interpret and apply the regulations. So in this decision that I have as an example from 2023, I put this first part in here. It's a direct quote. If a parent requests an IEE at public expense, the school district must, without unnecessary delay, either ensure that the IEE is provided at public expense or initiate due process to establish that its evaluation is appropriate, or that the evaluation obtained by the parent does not meet the school district criteria. So I include that in there just to say, this is the SRO's interpretation. It is what it says in the regs. Those are our only two options. We can't say no, or we can't say we'll only fund up to this amount. But here, this direct quote is where the SRO has explicitly adopted Letter to BOUS and says, the district argues on appeal that the hearing officer erred in ordering the independent educational audiological evaluation because the district did not first obtain an educational audiological evaluation with which the parents disagreed. However, that argument is without merit because guidance from the United States Department of Education's Office of Special Education Programs indicates that if a parent disagrees with an evaluation because a child was not assessed in that particular area, the parent has a right to request an IEE to assess the child in that area to determine whether the child has a disability and the nature and extent of special education or related services that the child needs. And you can see they quote, they reference Letter to BOUS. So this exception is really diminishing. So we're just narrowing back down to, even if we haven't evaluated in that area, there are some cases out there to suggest that our only option, if we want to say no, is to initiate due process. There was also a Second Circuit decision in 2020. The Second Circuit is pretty high up. So in New York State, the first level is an impartial due process hearing. We kind of use impartial hearing, due process hearing. We use those synonymously. And then if there's an appeal, it goes to the SRO. And then if there's an appeal from there, the party who's appealing can choose to go to state or federal court, but we usually go to federal court. So here in Buffalo, we're in the Western District of New York for federal court. And then if that's appealed, then it goes to the Second Circuit. And the Second Circuit is New York, Connecticut, and New Hampshire, Vermont. Yeah, I always forget. I always switch. And then the appeal after that is the Supreme Court. So decisions that you make from day to day could someday be before the Supreme Court. No pressure on that. But the likelihood of that happening is really low, just so you know. But the Second Circuit is a high court. And this was actually a Connecticut case, if I remember correctly, but it did have some language that applied to us. And I might be wrong about this being a Connecticut case. So in this situation, the district did a reevaluation. They did an FBA. The parents requested a bunch of IEEs, including an FBA. And the district refused to grant the IEE request because it was due to schedule its next reevaluation in a few months. And so before this case came out, we weren't sure what the statute of limitations was for IEE. So we would say, how far back can a parent go? Can they disagree with an evaluation from 5 years ago and say they want an IEE for that? So we would take our chances sometimes and say, well, let's apply the general statute of limitations for special education, which is 2 years. Well, this decision told us no, we can't do that. This decision said there is no statute of limitations as related to IEEs. Parents can go back 3 years. They can go back farther. It doesn't matter that you're doing another eval or will be doing one soon. There's no statute of limitations. They're entitled to it if they disagree with an evaluation conducted by the CSE, regardless of when. But something else that this decision said is that an FBA is not an evaluation for purposes of requesting an IEE at public expense. So this Second Circuit decision said parents are not entitled to an IEE for an FBA, that it doesn't meet the criteria for an evaluation. Now, unfortunately, since then, the SRO has issued decisions ordering FBA IEEs. So they're not following the Second Circuit rule, which is higher than the SRO. The SRO is arguably required to follow what the Second Circuit says. So it's a bit of an unanswered question, but some districts are taking the position that an FBA is not entitled to an IEE. Just know if that's challenged and if it makes its way to the SRO, that probably would not be upheld, that decision. IEEs are on purpose incredibly parent friendly. It's on purpose. It's supposed to be very easy for parents to ask for IEEs and for districts to be obligated to pay for them.
And we have a question, but
Sure.
I'll defer to you if you want to take this now or later. It's a question about a D class. The question is, like, to sum it up, so the district wants to D class. They proposed a reevaluation. The parent refused consent. The student also met all his goals.
I have a hearing on this issue right now. And the attorney did not know that the parent refused consent. The hearing request is all about how we didn't do the reevaluation and it was an improper D class. And I took a screenshot of the parent's signature refusing consent and texted it to the attorney and said, I'm assuming you don't know about this. So we're in a really strong position. So parents can't hold us hostage. If we're asking for a reevaluation and if they refuse to give us consent for that reevaluation, I think it's defensible to move forward with considering declassification if we have other evidence to support that. So things like, has a student achieved their goals? Are there no other goals that we would work on? Is a student really achieving appropriately in the general education setting? Do we have other progress monitoring or other data to support that decision? I think that would be defensible if we did ask for the reevaluation and the parent said no. Do you agree, Jeff?
Sort of. I mean, I would take the same position. I guess what we'd have to be prepared for is when they'd say, well, we must have thought they needed an evaluation. That's why we proposed it. I think it's putting us in a tough spot. What I find in the D class, the key issue in D class, in my view, is always, did we give the parent opportunities to reevaluate before? Like, you need to ask them like 3 times. Hey, we're going to think of declassifying. You want some evals? Okay, we're scheduling the meeting. You want some evals? We're at the meeting. Before we do this, you want some more evals? If we do that, we're in a good position. Here, I think we'd have to be prepared for, why did we propose our testing? And I think we would just say, to be super safe, but we really didn't need them.
Or because we knew the parent disagreed. So we proposed an evaluation.
Right. Because if we lose, the hearing officer would have said, we should have initiated a hearing. to get involved, which seems extraordinary.
Oh, yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think I would do exactly what you're doing in your case, Ann, but it's unfortunately, sometimes in special ed, the rules are impossible. And it's possible that it's a hearing officer could come up with something very unreasonable.
Yeah, those are good points. Because we can initiate due process to override a parent's lack of consent. If a parent refuses consent for an evaluation, we can initiate due process for that purpose. We can't initiate due process to override their refusal to provide consent for special education services. Or if they revoke consent for special education services, we can't initiate due process for that. Thanks, Jeff. Okay, so we're getting a lot of requests for neuropsychological evaluations due to parents' disagreement with our psychological or psychoeducational IEE. And the SRO has been issuing a number of decisions that say if the parents disagree with our psych eval, that entitles them to a neuropsychological IEE that's funded by the district. And with that letter to BAUS, it kind of doesn't matter, right? Because that's entitling them to areas that we haven't assessed, even if it's close. As far as how this applies to learning disabilities, sometimes parents, or any diagnosis, but it comes up with learning disabilities, sometimes parents really want to know, does my child have dyslexia? They just really want to know that. They're, knowing if that's what it is, the diagnosis might give parents comfort. It might make them feel, kind of like a medical model. If we know the diagnosis and we know what the treatment is. And there's nothing in the law that prohibits CSEs from saying that a child has dyslexia or dysgraphia or dyscalculia. There's nothing in the law. We've covered this before in the past. But when CSEs say we're not allowed to diagnose, or even if a school psychologist says I'm not allowed to diagnose, that's not accurate under the law. Without getting into this could be a topic just on its own. So we are permitted to say, yes, this child has dyslexia. And if we're going through the evaluation, and if we're saying the student has a specific learning disorder in reading in the areas of fluency and decoding and encoding, that's dyslexia. So it's okay to say it, right? I know that it makes people feel nervous, but it's okay to say it. The law allows us to say it. There's lots of guidance out there that says we're allowed to say it in state and federal guidance. You're not required to say it. School psychologists should be competent at assessing in this area. And if they're not, then they need to gain that competency to assess, because again, dyslexia is a specific learning disability in reading fluency, decoding, and encoding, which again, when you look at the criteria for SLD, those are areas that come up. Maybe not encoding, actually. Spelling is not one of the areas, but still, that usually goes with dyslexia. So you might be able to avoid some IEE requests if you're just comfortable with calling a spade. This is what it is, right? You're not required to, but I do see parents ask for IEEs because they want to know, is it dyslexia? I mean, don't say it if we don't think the child actually has dyslexia, right? But that's okay too. That's okay to talk with a parent and say, dyslexia is really a reading disorder in the areas of decoding, encoding, fluency. Your child is in the average range in those areas. We're seeing the reading comprehension is emerging as an issue. So that's the area that we think we need to address. It doesn't look like dyslexia. It's okay to have these conversations with parents through the CSE process. So for IEEs, district procedures, you need to make sure that your policy and procedures are up to date. That's very important because it's legally required, okay? And it's also always changing. So most IEE policies that I review say things like parents are entitled to IEEs at public expense, administrative regulations or procedures will be developed. I'm good with that. Because IEE law is always kind of slightly changing, I'm good with the bulk of it being in regulations or procedures that are developed by administrators that we can easily update as we need to. It's also okay if you have a very detailed policy. There's no right or wrong way to do it. But if you have a policy that says that regulations or procedures will be developed, make sure you have them. A lot of times when I ask, the administrators don't realize that they need them. And those procedures have to include certain information. So it has to include, let me see. I would have the procedures explain the legal considerations for when a parent is entitled to an IEE, what the district's response to those requests will be, that identifies the criteria of the evaluator, because that is required that we have established criteria. Some districts have that separate to supplement their procedures. That's okay. You just have to have them written and ready to go. So for criteria, it needs to be the geographic, credential, and fee criteria. And also, we are required to have a list of local evaluators who comply with the district's criteria. So we're required to have that list. Make sure you're updating it from time to time. We only need to give it to parents if they ask for it. There's nothing wrong with giving it to them every time. You know, I don't have a strong opinion on that, but we have to have that list available. Also in our procedures should be something about how if the IEE does not meet the criteria the district uses for an evaluation, which I have slides on that, the parent has to be provided with the opportunity to demonstrate if their child's unique circumstances justify an IEE outside of the district's criteria. So that would be the next step. Okay, so you're asking for this evaluator who doesn't meet our fee criteria or our credential criteria. Please explain to me why your child's unique circumstances justifies using an evaluator that doesn't meet our criteria. And then when they provide that justification, our options are to grant and pay in full or to initiate due process. If the district prevails at an impartial hearing that it initiates on an IEE, the parent can still get an IEE, but we just don't pay for it. But as far as the CSE process of reviewing the IEE, it's the same. We're required to convene the CSE to review anything the parents give us and to consider the recommendations. We are not required to adopt them. It's hard to say no to certain recommendations if we don't have our own data to support that decision. Again, the reason why I say more data, always better, always more defensible that we get. So the criteria, the location, we need to establish the location of the evaluator. I have had parents say, I'm going to Baltimore and I want you to pay for the whole family to go down there for a week and for our travel and our food and our hotel. So we want to have a location criteria on there. This should say EG 90 miles, not IE. It's not that is. It's an example, 90 miles. It can be anything, but it has to be reasonable. You can't say 5 miles. That's not reasonable. I usually see things like 90 miles on there. Sometimes for districts that are maybe more rural, it might be a larger distance. We have to have the evaluator credentials, and these credentials have to match the credentials we use for our own evaluations. So we have to say, for example, that we would accept a psychological IEE conducted by a certified school psychologist. But certified school psychologists are not legally permitted to conduct private evaluations. But that's got to be in our criteria because we allow certified school psychologists to do that because they are entitled to do that within the context of their employment through a school. But we would also put a licensed psychologist on there as well, and some people are both, and a licensed psychologist can legally conduct these evals. That brings up different ethical issues, but we can't say, no, you chose a certified school psych and they're not legally able to conduct this eval. We can't say that, even though that's true. And then fees, we have to establish the fee criteria for each evaluation. We do that by calling evaluators in our area and saying, what do you charge? And then the upper end, not the average, the upper end of what they charge is what we should put in our fee criteria. And make sure you update this. I'm still regularly seeing fee criteria where psych evals, and I'm saying this without any judgment, okay? No judgment towards anybody. Everybody's busy and doing the best you can. I know that. Okay, me too, right? So, but I still regularly see psychological IEEs $1,000. There is no psychologist who's doing it for under $3,000 right now. So that would never be defensible to go to hearing and say, no, it's $1,000. So that's also just something to stay on top of and keep an eye on to make sure that your fee criteria makes sense. And then we talked about the list of evaluators, and we talked about how the CSE has to convene. We don't have to give more weight to that IEE, but we do have to consider all of the recommendations and have a conversation about whether to adopt any of those for the student. So make sure that your procedures and criteria are up to date. Make sure that you're familiar with your policy and you know if you need to develop regulations or procedures to go with that. Avoid conducting evaluations outside of the CSE or 504 process. There is no legal mechanism to conduct an individual evaluation outside of one of those procedures. Parents aren't entitled to IEEs for 504, by the way, but it gets really weird if we do a full eval and use that eval to say, you know what, we don't need a CSE referral. That's so problematic under child find. We're making a CSE decision outside of CSE without the parents' involvement, but districts do it. They do this full evaluation. They say, all right, we don't need to refer because the kid wouldn't be eligible anyway. What do we do if the parent now comes in and asks for an IEE? We just did an impermissible CSE evaluation outside of CSE. It makes it weird for us. So always just do it through CSE. When in doubt, do it through CSE. Ensure that we assess in all areas of suspected disability so that we have our own data. And if we get an IEE request after we declassify or we find a student ineligible, you would reconvene the CSE as an initial eligibility determination meeting to review that IEE. And you can think about then, is there any other data that you want to propose to the parent that the district wants to collect as well to help with that reconvene? Okay, 1 minute, sorry. 1 minute over. Are there any questions? Yes.
Just a question. So we have a parent who requested an evaluation for dyslexia. The student's IEP already indicates that the student has dyslexia. They were already diagnosed by an IEE with dyslexia 5 years ago, and the parent is requesting the evaluation again.
They're requesting an IEE? Yeah, same answer. You either have to pay for it or initiate due process. Yeah. Is that a waste of everyone's time? Yes. Yeah. Sorry. Are you sure? Okay.
I guess, is there like, how broad is the scope of the types of evaluations that can be completed for an IEE?
That is such a good question. So it's conceivably what would be a CSE evaluation. But there's districts that might say, you know, we don't do music therapy evals here. But music therapy is on the continuum. So that wouldn't be a reason to say no. So it's hard to say how far to go. We're seeing this come up with vision evaluations. You're actually seeing this in Buffalo more than we're seeing this in Rochester. And it is looking like the way the case law is, and Jeff, you can jump in on this because you've had more vision evals than me, that the SRO is saying that a vision eval is fair game. Like these, what are they called? These functional vision eval, you know, kids need vision therapy. But yeah, it's hard. It would be a weird situation if they asked for something that we would never consider through CSE. That would probably require some analysis to decide what to do.
Right.
A pure interpretation is you got to initiate due process.
Yeah,
right.
It's going to be hard to totally dismiss a category of evaluations as not helpful. Very hard. So sometimes what we say is the time to fight would be at the meeting as opposed to at the evaluation stage. You're very rarely gonna say it's on here. It's just because it's not favorable. Now, can you argue that the vision service is not needed for a FAPE? That's a much stronger argument to be made at the IEP stage as opposed to at the evaluation, because you never know in theory what they're going to find out.
Yeah, when I said your option is to initiate due process, I meant if you want to say no.
Right. Yeah.
Right. If you grant it, then you don't have to initiate due process ever. If you say no.
One more question. Sure.
Okay, I'm trying to figure out if there's any way you can go in terms of the response to an IE, if there's anything other than the two options, either grant it or file a due process complaint. One, a parent, we're doing an initial, we're within the timelines. The parent requests an IE before they receive the evaluations and before the meeting. What are your thoughts on that?
I have this question in my inbox right now from somebody. So again, a pure interpretation is you either grant or initiate due process. Could the parent argue there's a child find issue? You should have evaluated a long time ago. I shouldn't have to wait for these initials. You didn't assess in all areas of suspected disability. They could argue all of that. If the district wants to push back and say, wait a minute, we at least need to finish ours first, the district just needs to know that there's a risk there. So if the parent were to initiate a state complaint, for years, state complaints have been coming back across the state saying, you can't ever say no. You have to initiate due process. So districts take these risks all the time. It's just our job to share what those are, right? And if we go to a hearing, that makes it a little more difficult to predict because you're at the mercy of whoever the hearing officer is. But still, I think a pure interpretation is you have two options: grant and pay or initiate due process.
Okay, one more.
Okay.
Parent denies consent for the reevaluation multiple times. Distrust doesn't want us to do it, but says, I'd like an independent person to do those.
That's easy. Yeah. They're entitled to it unless you initiate due process. There's nothing in the law that says you didn't allow us to do a reeval, so we're going to deny it. The law does not ever say you can deny it without initiating due process. The only time we had was that exception, but Letter to Baus got rid of that for us once the SRO started adopting that.
So I think, well, what about, so interesting.
Yeah, Jeff disagrees with me, which is good.
No, I don't.
Yeah, it's good. No, it's good. It's good.
No, I don't. No, I don't think. I think the question was, it wasn't the apples to oranges question, which is like, we did X, Y, and Z evals, and now you requested A. It was district proposes an evaluation, and the parent refuses to consent, and then says, I want an IEE for that.
I guess I was assuming with that question that we have already evaluated in that area, but it was 3 years ago, which my answer was based on that assumption. But again, what would you say? Take your chances?
Well, I think the slam dunk would be to, and if you initiate the hearing, your position is it should be denied because you denied us a chance.
I think that's a really strong position.
I think you'd win.
Yeah.
I think the question is, if you refuse to take that step, are you waiving that defense?
I've lost that issue.
Yeah.
Yes. I actually, here's a fact pattern, a real life IEE fact pattern. I'm sorry if the person this happened to is on right now, but I won't name who. The parent requests an IEE. The district denied because the evaluator was too expensive and not the right credentials. The parent went to SED and submitted a state complaint. The state complaint said, no, you had to either pay or initiate due process. So we initiated due process, and then the hearing officer dismissed our case because he said we waited too long because we let all of that go, all that time go instead of initiating due process immediately. Now, I really wanted to appeal that. This was years ago. They didn't want to appeal at that point. They're like, it's not worth it. We'll just pay the $1,500, right? So, and I understand that, but that's just an example of what districts have had to deal with.
All set.
Okay.
What? Okay, I'm done. Any more? I had one more thing to conclude with when you're done. That's
Go for
okay.
it. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.
Are you totally done? Okay. Thanks, everyone. So I just, a bonus tip, if you have 1 second. So a couple, 2 or 3 weeks ago, I did a presentation for a BOCES on some student discipline issues. And I met with a couple of the CEQA regional associates before they wanted to just, check in to see if we see eye to eye on the issues. And we did, which is good. But they kind of gave a suggestion on a very niche issue that I just wanted to share. It deals with, okay, now hang with me for a second. This is provision of services to students who are suspended for students with disabilities. And there's 3 scenarios, just FYI. There's kids, the first 10 days of their suspension before you have to do a pattern. These kids are in the FAPE-free zone. So arguably, they don't even get special ed, which is crazy. But it's a very loose standard. If you give special ed services during those first 10 days, that's great. If you don't, we could say it's not FAPE denial. The other extreme is the kids where there's no nexus is found, and they get a long-term suspension, like 3 months or 6 months, whatever. Those kids, it's also easy. You need a CSE meeting to recommend the services during that time. The suggestion was for the middle group. Okay, These are the kids who they're suspended for a short time period, let's say 3 days, but we're beyond 10 days in the year. So this would be kids who it's a it's no pattern was found, or more common would be let's say it's a three. Actually, no. Let's say you're at day 12 and you want to do 3 more days. Not so you don't need a superintendent's hearing. This is what you have to work very hard for these kids. You need a superintendent. You need to have a manifestation meeting because you have a pattern and you're over 10 for 3 more days, and you have a manifestation meet and you find no nexus. Then you have the green light to suspend them for 3 more days. These kids, there's a strange rule where you have to informally meet to determine their special eds. They get special ed services because they're over 10 days in the year. So these kids get special ed services, but there's not a CSE meeting. So it says like they're supposed to have a meeting amongst the staff members to figure it out. So basically, the special ed teacher calling the tutor saying, hey, this kid has an IEP. Make sure you do X, Y, and Z when you're giving the tutoring. So this, I think schools do this. But what CEQA said is we are not documenting that discussion, and we're not documenting what was decided. And so the warning was this could be something that's audited in the future. And if it is audited and you didn't document, it's going to be hard to prove it. So the suggestion was, if we're going to do it right, if we're over 10, a couple more days, no CSE meeting, and you're actually thinking, how do I meet the students' disability-related needs during the suspension? Do something somewhere to document it, whether it's in the suspension letter or it's in an email to yourself or something. Because I got the feeling, I think there's been a lot of training from CEQA on these type of issues. And this is clearly one that they brought up. So just kind of food for thought to document that, because I get the feeling we're not documenting it. I don't know who would think to document it either, but now that we know. So I just wanted to share that on your drive home. And also we have some extra pastries, so you could take that. So thanks, everybody. Thank you for coming. We're looking forward to future programs. I'm sure we'll have something over the summer, some webinars, and then we'll be back in the fall. Have a great summer and safe travels.
Go on summer break. Okay.